I think we are becoming increasingly aware of natural disasters from the standpoint it's not if so much as when, and I think that's really creating a tipping point for us. I want to speak with you today about four areas. First of all, the perspective from which I'm speaking. Second of all, the focus on recovery. Third, the critical steps that are necessary in planning for recovery. And then closing with one example from Christ Church. First of all, I am both representing my company, AECOM. I'm also the vice chair of the Private Sector Advisory Group to the UN ISDR. And then lastly, in my own community, I'm actually an elected official for the last 6 years. So I really bring a bit of a different perspective to this topic. First of all, if we could go, let's look at the private sector and how we're engaging with UN ISDR. The private sector partnership, or something that we often refer to as PSP, is a group of 97 member companies that come from 37 countries. It's truly a global organization of large companies, small companies, represented with 35% of the members from Asia Pacific, 23% from Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and 42% from the Americas. And the Private Sector Advisory Group has been extremely active in the last several years, as you see on this slide from several, if we could go to the next slide, please, several different outputs that have been occurred. Next slide, please. We're moving right along. There you go. The private sector really came together on this topic because of our concern and our desire to become more engaged in the topic. There's that phrase that, you know, we're all in one boat together. And you really can't say, well, my end of the boat is not sinking, because we're in one boat. And so the Private Sector Advisory Group and the PSP have become increasingly active with HFA2. We started out with initially 5 working groups. I was very involved in one of the working groups where we actually created the first ever disaster resilience scorecard. And we did that based on the 10 essentials. As an excellent starting point to frame a tool for communities to really assess degree of preparedness for a natural disaster. There have been several other items that the RISE initiative, which is a resilient investment initiative which was launched in New York in May of 2014 with the target of raising $200 million of funds for disaster resilient investments. There have been several bulletins that have been released, several best practices that have been developed. So the PSP is a very active group of interested multinational companies and local companies as well. Probably half the membership are small business that are members of PSP. I also want to point out that if you pick a company like Shell, the largest company in the world, based on 2012 data, it's actually the 25th largest economy in the world. So there's a huge responsibility that comes with an organization of that size. And in fact, if you look at the top 100 economies in the world, 44 of those are multinational companies. So there's an important element here that, for engagement and involvement, not only in the response actions, but especially in the planning of the response. So that's the Private Sector Advisory Group. If we go to the next one, we developed 5 visions for HFA2 going forward. And there was a wide degree of participation by the companies that make up the PSP to formulate these, and have got a great deal of buy-in. And so we're hoping that the next 10 years will be an era where there's a high level of private sector engagement with the public sector to better tackle disaster risk reduction. Now, I also would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about my company, right? AECOM. We are 100,000 employees. We're the world's largest design engineering firm, and we operate in 150 countries around the world, producing revenues of about $20 billion a year. We, over the last 20 years, have been active in over $4 billion of emergency response actions, primarily in North America, but expanding. So we bring also that perspective of seeing disaster and response actions, which has given a unique insight, I think, for developing more preventative actions. Now, lastly, in my community that I live, I've been a board member for the last 6 years, and we are very much dealing with the topic of emergency actions and disaster recovery as well. And we have about 120 small businesses in our community, in fact, more small businesses than large businesses. And we're working at how do we integrate the small business activities with our residents as well. If we could go to the next slide, please. I want to take just a couple of minutes and talk about the 10 essentials. And because we base the disaster resilience scorecard on the 10 essentials. I won't go through and read each one, but suffice it to say that half of these essentials are really related to disaster recovery. And really, if you're going to be effective in recovery, you need to be active in planning. And I think that's often been a missing step. And it goes back to that perspective that a disaster always seemed to be in the future, not currently now. So the planning has been jeopardized, not performed, not given the attention. Inherently, we know that by planning that we're going to gain greater benefit through implementation. And I think there's increasingly proof of that with some of the experiences that we've heard most recently. But we've lived in so much of a now period that we haven't really put the emphasis on planning that is absolutely essential. And there's that proverb that if you don't know where you are, any road will get you there. I don't think we really know where we are in bringing together the public and the private sector to address disaster recovery, because we haven't entered into sitting at the table in the planning phase. We haven't understood how the business continuity plan that a local business has is related to the city plan. I did facilitate a meeting in the city and county of San Francisco between 15 members of the public sector with 15 members of the private sector, of which no one knew each other from the very beginning, not even the people within the city, because it's, you know, a city is a very large organism with many different departments, all with a piece of resilience in their job description. But that was a very enlightening activity, which ultimately did lead us to develop the disaster resilience scorecard, because we saw that a tool was needed to gauge where am I today and where do I need to be in 1, 3, 5 years from now. So it's a planning tool of sorts. And I think it really has been used now by probably more than 24 cities around the world as a planning tool. We did this with IBM on a pro bono basis. We saw the need and we wanted to fill that need with this tool. The tool will be further modified with the revision of the 10 essentials, which will be coming out later this year. And again, it'll be put into the public domain for public use. So I think it does provide a good map for a community, and I use the word community to represent public and private sector within the area. It does represent a good tool for the community to understand where they are and what are the actions needed going forward. And when done to perfection, would include both the public and the private sector addressing the scorecard. Not done by the public, but really completed with the public and the private sector together. It's an 81 character algorithm. Each component is weighted. Not every essential is equal to the other. But again, it's to really provide an insight on what gaps do exist in the community and how to fill those gaps. I think that's a very critical phase for recovery, is to get more engagement in the planning phase. And we all respond when something bad happens, but we don't get too excited about coming to the table on the planning side. And that's an area I think of high interest and high need. We need to look at what are the likely scenarios for my community. Often we'll think about, well, I could have a hurricane, or I could have a typhoon, or I could have an earthquake. What we're really beginning to see now are mega events where you not only have a hurricane, but you also have an earthquake. And then how do you respond to that? And only by developing, I think, a simulation for that community can you adequately prepare for a proper response. What are those critical elements for that community that could be affected by that natural disaster? Is it water? Is it power? Is it food? Is it sanitation? You know, if you don't have power, you're not going to have water. So what are your options to mitigate that impact? Is it bottled water supply? What are the options for power? Is it more renewable? Is there a renewable strategy here that could insulate the power? What about the distribution? What about backup generators? Oh, we heard about propane. What's the strategy that if my primary power source goes out, what are my options? And I'm not saying that you create an answer for all those questions, but you need to ask those questions to come up with some viable mitigating strategies. The same with food. You know, the typical city will have 2.5 days of food supply on hand. What if you happen to live in a community that has bridges and roads that are taken out by a natural disaster? How would you evacuate? How would you feed? Going beyond water, how would you take care of the waste? And there needs to be a set of mitigating strategies that are developed. And we talked about UPS perhaps with excellent logistics support. How do you look at what's in the community? What resources do we have? What resources do we have from the private sector, not only locally, but perhaps corporately, that could be accessed in the event of an emergency? So when I think about this whole topic area, one of the things that's very important is that I think we need to address this topic on at least 4 levels. One is on a cognitive basis, recognizing, you know, the importance, the logic of why we need to do this. I think we're there for the most part. But we've also got to communicate a sense of urgency and motivation. We've got to address that emotional element to really spur action to occur. Thirdly, we would be naive if we didn't consider the political issues, the political ramifications, and how those need to be addressed locally, regionally, nationally, and how those resources can be brought to bear in a situation. And then lastly, going beyond the political dimensions, it's also looking at the resource constraints. What resources are truly available within a community, public or private? What are available regionally, nationally, or internationally that could be brought to bear? Those are all part, I think, of an important scenario planning that can really produce a much more effective response and recovery action. And my last slide, or next to last, is looking at the Christchurch. We saw some slides that were very, very revealing recently. One of the things that Christchurch did, which was very instrumental, was have a grant program available that went beyond, you could get a grant well beyond for physical damage. There was also a salary continuation program, I believe for 12 weeks, which provided a tremendous amount of stability. Comments were made by the 8,400 businesses that the earthquake support subsidy was one of the most critical pieces of support received following the earthquake. So that was a very collaborative effort between the public and the private sector. We're learning far more from the experiences that we've had, and it gives us more vision on what we need to do in the future. So in summary, I really want to say that we are in this together. There's no division between the public and the private sector. I like to think that our employees, when they go home at night, are public sector members, as I'm a public servant as well. So, you know, it's a misnomer to really separate us. We're really one, and this is an issue of such tremendous proportion that we've got to address it together proactively. Thank you.